information that I had put together on the Ku Klux Klan that had a clavern here in Redlands. And I'm excited because where I didn't follow through and write up anything, because all I had was little snippets, and I depend on newspapers for local information, and the newspapers were pitiful, pitiful. I didn't check the San Bernardino Sun because I anticipated the same type of coverage that was happening here in Redlands. And so let's see, some upcoming programs. Next month, you'll have to endure me. I'm going to do a program on before and after, taking pictures and photos of homes, many of them Victorians when they were built, and then what they looked like later, and then later, and then later. And in some cases, 3 or 4 pictures of the same home over the years. I'm just doing the residential area. I'm not doing the downtown. That's even more revealing in terms of how architecture and our fads have changed over the years. And then we have other programs occurring through the rest of the season, and you'll find those in our newsletter, which we put out monthly. As long as I stall here, you're saying, why don't you get to the guy who's going to be introducing the program? And so without further ado, here's Ron Running, our program director and vice president of the Historical Society.
Thanks, Tom. It's always a challenge following Tom with the introduction. I got a feast meal what I had prepared, but anyway, our speaker tonight, Jennifer Tilton, is associate professor at the University of Redlands in race and ethnic studies. She got her Ph.D. and master's in anthropology from the University of Michigan and her undergraduate degree from Princeton. She can't hear you. Okay. Let's see. Is this? There we go. There we go. Okay. She's specializing in interdisciplinary scholarship combining urban anthropology, geography, history, and public policy. So she, in 2010, her book, Dangerous or Endangered, Race and the Politics of Youth in Urban America was published. She has been spending a lot of time more recently in mapping a people's history in the Inland Empire. So we'll turn the rest of the time over to Jennifer.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm tempted to try to go back and play this music, but maybe I'll play it at the end. All right, you need me to talk over here. You got it. Okay, so those of you who were here in person got to hear a bit of the Mootonic Four, a singing group that emerged out of Redlands Second Baptist. Those of you who are online, maybe I'll play you a little clipping at the end. Clarence Butler, who's here with us today, is one of the amazing singers who you heard, and the source of many of the stories that I will share with you today. I'll also honor John Coleman, who's here, who is also kind of one of my guides and teachers in this project. Before I begin though, I want to share a little bit of the story that kind of gave rise to this beautiful music that you were hearing before, and share a little bit of the work we've been doing with Black elders to document Black history in the Inland Empire. But I guess first I want to say why I think uncovering Black history in Redlands matters, right? Because it's tempting to say Black folks were only a small percentage of the Redlands community, especially in the early 20th century, hovering around 1% from 1900 through 1940. And so maybe their stories aren't as important as others in the region. It's also tempting to say that people of color, just their stories in deep history aren't as accessible in the archive because they didn't document their history as much as white folks who had more money and power. But I think both of those temptations are fundamentally wrong. First, I would argue that Black history tells us important truths about Redlands itself, the forces that made the town what it is, and how the past continues to shape our present. And second, I think the historical record, like our archives and our newspapers, like Tom was talking about, they document what we bother to look at. And so when we actually start to look to preserve more diverse histories, we discover an incredible range of rich stories that challenge our assumptions about the past. And so just briefly want to say a couple things about my path to this research. When I came to the U of R, I started looking for material to build into my classes that documented Mexican-American, African-American, Asian-American histories in the IE, because my students wanted to know the histories of the communities they came from. And it was hard to find a lot, right? As kind of Tom said, there were fragments in newspaper stories occasionally. Tom shared his clipping files that gave me little hints of stories. Cheryl Brown from the Black Voice News would come and talk to my classes and tell stories that she was sort of preserving in her memory. And people, of course, told me the important story of Israel Beale and how Redlands was home to 2 important historic Black churches and to the Colored Citizen newspaper. But I only found bits and pieces of the community that built those institutions. And I found almost nothing about how those communities changed over the course of the 20th century. So I began to reach out and build some relationships with Black community leaders who have long been documenting Black history in this region. Over the last 2 years in particular, my students and I have begun to work in close partnership with Wilma Amina Carter, who founded the Bridges That Carried Us Over project, and has worked with a group of volunteers over the last 15 years to collect 140 oral histories that document Black history throughout the Inland Empire. They're now being archived at Cal State San Bernardino, and students from Redlands, from Cal State and UCR are helping in that process. There were very few Redlands voices in that archive though. So we reached out to Bishop Green, the historian and pastor, one of the pastors at Second Baptist Church, and she helped us identify and conduct interviews with Black families who had memories of his historic community here in Redlands. I met elders with incredible memories like Clarence Butler, one of the Mootonic singers, and John Coleman, who moved to Redlands in the late 50s and was active in one of the early human relations councils. We chased down children and grandchildren of some of the people that I'll talk to today, who I think are with us online. And we dug into census records and turned to key sources in the Black press, not just exactly because of what Tom mentioned, right? The white press was not a very good source for rich stories. But the Black press was, and fortunately we didn't only have the Colored Citizen, we also have the California Eagle out of Los Angeles, which through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s had columns documenting the social and political life of Redlands Black community. So we began then to use ArcGIS to build maps and geo-referenced archives that would help us bring these historic communities to life. And I'll note that this project I'm talking about today is part of a bigger effort in collaboration with Kathy Gudis at UCR that we're calling a People's History of the IE. It's a project that aims to diversify the ways we tell the history of the Inland Empire and to create story maps that bring that history to life. And I think we'll drop the collection, the kind of emerging collection, either in the chat on Zoom at the end of the session, or we'll put it, share it with the group later on Facebook. Okay, so let me just share a couple of the maps and stories about Black Redlands that we've begun to uncover. And I'll note this is totally a work in progress. Every day I'm discovering new stories as I dig into, talk to people and dig into the newspapers. So I need your help. If you have stories to share, please bring them. All right, so hold on, I'm trying to now go forward. Will it let me go forward? Okay, there we go. Okay, so here you'll see a map. This is from our 1910 Black Redlands story map. The dots on this map show where Black folks lived and ran businesses, worshiped, and met in fraternal organizations like the Oddfellows in 1905 to 1910. I'm not going to talk a lot about this map now because you can go online and play with it. You can click on every dot and see the people, where they lived, who they were, what institutions they built. But I'll just point out a couple of patterns here. Businesses and churches were mixed into downtown space, and homes were scattered mostly across downtown and into the north side. Some Black folks lived here in the south of Redlands, though most, but not all, of those dots were Black servants in white households. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, both because it's already published and you can read it, and also because I really want to focus on the period of the 20s to the 1960s today. That's what I'm working on now, to develop a story map that is like the 1910 ones. But it's also because this period before and after World War II really lays the pattern for suburban development that we live in today. And so I think understanding this history helps us understand our present. So to do so, I'm going to tell you the story of Robert Burton. I've been obsessed with stories about Robert Burton since I first uncovered his name in a newspaper article from 1968 that was written by Amos Isaac, who some of you may remember. He only passed away a couple of years ago. So Both John Coleman and Clarence Butler have fond memories of him. And he's turned out to me to be this really important figure in the history of the city. And so I'm going to use him to kind of frame our conversation today. Some of this work has really been influenced by one of my students who did a lot of research, Brandon Alvarez. So I'll kind of honor his contribution here as well. So Robert Burton first moved to Redlands in the early 20s. When he got off the train in downtown Redlands, he asked a white man where he might find lodging. The man responded, "Well, son, there ain't no place for you to stay here in Redlands." Mr. Burton, not discouraged, continued further down the street where he found the Black proprietor of a shoe shine stand, who directed him to lodging in a Black family's home. Soon, Robert Burton's wife and 2 sons followed him to Redlands, where they joined the already established small, thriving Black community clustered around the 2 churches now on High and Stewart Street by 1928 or so. And so this is some of the places we've begun to document, we'll talk about today. The story of Robert Burton's arrival in Redlands, which he told decades later to Amos Isaac, captures to me the essence of how Black families built social networks and community ties that would help them thrive, despite persistent racial discrimination in housing and employment throughout much of the 20th century. Over the next few decades, Robert Burton and his family joined the church at Second Baptist, built a neighborhood grocery store, and ultimately he became a realtor who helped the next generation of Black families navigate the barriers of racism in housing to achieve the dream of homeownership. Now, when Robert Burton moved to Redlands in 1922, the Ku Klux Klan was resurgent throughout Southern California. Lynn Hudson's recent book documents how the Klan policed the color line from the 20s to the 40s, mobilizing white residents to defend all white neighborhoods and recreational facilities, as a growing number of Black homeowners moved to California in the first wave of the Great Migration and began to advocate for their rights in new ways. In Redlands too, the Klan grew in the mid-20s, when A.H. Smith of Brookside Avenue was the Klan Kegel for the local chapter. You see here just a few of the places of the public events that have been reported in the press from 22 to 27 in Redlands and San Bernardino. We've begun to start to map these so we can see where they took place. And I'll just tell you a couple stories here. There was a Klan mass meeting attended by 1,000 at the Redlands Amphitheater, now the Redlands Bowl, on August 4th, 1924, where a pastor from Redlands Christian Church led the opening prayer. A couple weeks later, you see here an advertisement for a Klan initiation, which took place right by the university, gotta say, East Colton and Judson. And the Redlands Daily Fax the next day wrote about an immense crowd that attended and watched the fiery cross burn. A few years later, in 1927, the Klan showed up to a July 4th parade on Orange Street. So it kind of went up and down Orange Street from Colton. They were led by 3 horses in red and white robes, with the Klan knights and ladies in full regalia, marching and riding in cars with crosses, fiery crosses on their hoods. The San Bernardino Sun, actually, in this case, was much more enthusiastic about the Klan than the Redlands Daily Fax. And they especially praised their picturesque and striking display and the Klan's patriotism and loyalty to the United States, because nearly all the marchers carried American flags and some carried lighted torches. They, in fact, loved the fact that the ladies of the Ku Klux Klan's float was entirely covered with flags. Now, there was some controversy about the Klan within Redlands' white community. The Redlands Daily Fax occasionally engaged in some more explicit critique of the Klan, once describing it as un-American and insisting, quote, "There was no necessity of the Ku Klux Klan in a civilized community, and certainly not in Redlands." I don't know why I love that quote. As some of you know, the Christian Church of Redlands became a site of some of those conflicts. It was located right here by the YMCA on Olive Street. It had informal connections to the Klan from the early 20s, but when they hired a more explicitly Klan-affiliated preacher in 1925, I believe, some members left and the church splintered between the ins and the outs. And Tom actually knows a lot of that story. The mid-20s was a high point of Klan visibility, but the Klan didn't simply disappear afterwards. We find traces in the 30s and 40s in the IE. For instance, in 1932, local members from Redlands attended a secret meeting of 250 Klan members in San Bernardino to, quote, plan a fight against the growth of communism in the US, as the Depression deepened and critiques of the economic order did as well. Now, we honestly don't know much about how the Klan affected the Black and Mexican communities in Redlands at the time, and I wish we knew more. I've kind of mapped here, the locations of the center of the Black community with these Klan locations to sort of just get us to think about the fear and dismay that Black folks in Redlands, many of whom were refugees from the Jim Crow South, might have felt as they saw the hoods and the organized white supremacy in their hometown. We can trace, though, tiny hints of Black political organizing in response that are really interesting, because in that very same month of August 1924, the California Eagle reports calls for an educational mass meeting that would take place simultaneously in Redlands, San Bernardino, and Riverside. In Redlands, the meeting, I think, took place at St. Paul AME Church just 2 days after that public initiation in Redlands. So again, don't know what they were organizing exactly, but they were clearly coming together to respond in significant ways. So although the Klan was controversial among white residents of Redlands, more polite forms of discrimination and systematic exclusion were accepted by most through much of the 20th century, certainly the first 2/3. You can see more of these stories in one of our story maps that's called The Segregation of Public Accommodations in Redlands. But what I want to highlight today is the way some of the racial boundaries started to harden in Southern California between the 20s and the 40s, with new waves of Black migration out of the South. In Redlands, in fact, we see a sort of shift from the Black community being more integrated into downtown in terms of its social institutions to being concentrated north of the railroad tracks around Stewart Street and High by the late 20s. So starting in the 20s, white communities in Southern California were in fact creating new mechanisms to create white segregated space. So we often think that like racism gets better over time, but it goes up and down in waves, and the 20s were not a good time. The 20s to the 40s were not a good time. So one thing we see looking into how this segregated space was created was that in the 20s, racial restrictions in home deeds were sort of invented in Southern California. And we found a few of these in Redlands. You see here the language that was used both in the 1925 McKinley Tract, which is one of the earliest we found, and in a 1947 deed from a tract that the University of Redlands developed in Smiley Heights. And you see here, I don't know if it's easy to read, but you can see that it says the property cannot be rented, sold, or used by any person who is not white, with the important exception of folks who work for white folks, right? With domestic servants, right? So we've struggled to find out exactly how widespread these were in the 20s to the 40s and 50s, well, to the late 40s when they became, whatever, not technically legal. So if any of you have home deeds that you're willing to share with us that have these racial restrictions, please let us know, because we'd love to be able to map them. And the digging into the archive is a lot of work, as Brandon Alvarez could tell you. We have, though, found some other ways that racial boundaries were maintained. And these are a couple ways we see these in advertisements. So this Redlands, again, University of Redlands development called the Redlands Country Club Estates, on the right here, refers kind of vaguely here to restricted residential subdivision. Now this language, when you hear it, you're like, what does that mean, right? But in 1947, that was a very clear marker of white exclusivity. It was sort of a way to say, this is only available to white folks, but you didn't have to say it explicitly, right? You could be slightly nicer. The one on the left, however, Monte Vista Estates, which was developed by Art Gregory Jr. in 1947, is much more explicit. It also has the generic language up at the top, protective restrictions, but at the bottom it says, where white houses stay white. So there you have it. Now the Black community organized to fight for fair housing as soon as these were created in the 20s. The California's NAACP took the lead in challenging these restrictions. And they crafted a series of lawsuits over the 20s and 30s and 40s that led to the Supreme Court ruling in 1948 that said that the government could not enforce these racial restrictions. Interestingly, it didn't categorically forbid them. It just said the government couldn't enforce them. But racial discrimination in housing remained commonplace through the 60s as real estate agents continued to engage in more informal but no less systematic forms of racial steering and exclusion. John Coleman, who's with us today, when he moved to town in 1957, was a professional social worker from Boston with a master's degree, a wife, and an infant son. And in many ways, he found a welcoming community in Redlands and forged close relationships, many with his white coworkers at Patton Hospital who lived in Redlands. But the only apartment he could find to rent when he first arrived was across from the Texonia housing projects, much to the chagrin of his wife. As Mr. Coleman explained, quote, Black folks in Redlands didn't have a whole lot of choices too far away from that in terms of real estate. Later, when he searched for a home to buy in the early 1960s, he remembers a very nice Dutch real estate agent showing him all around town, but telling him, I can sell you the town, but I can't sell you a house. Now, I want to share a few stories of the strong community that grew through the 30s through the 50s within the confines of that segregated space. And we'll zoom into this small neighborhood around Stewart and High Street. We see here in the background a Sanborn map from 1938, right? And on top of it, the houses and businesses we found by combing through archives and census records, and particularly Clarence Butler's memory. Looking from the outside, you might, particularly from downtown, you might not even see this vibrant residential community in 1940, since it was separated from downtown by packing houses, Dill Lumber Company, and train tracks. But people who lived here in the 40s and 50s remember it as a tightly knit community where Black families from Texas and Arkansas, Mississippi and Kansas grew big gardens and shared the bounty of their produce. Where Clarence Butler and his friends, pictured here, could build go-karts and forts out of orange crates and donated lumber from nearby businesses. Where neighborhood kids, including Clabe Hangen, grew up speaking Spanish because so many of their neighbors spoke the language at home. Where an Italian neighbor told a nurse that his African-American friend, Fanny Sargent, was his daughter because he wanted to visit her when she was ill in the hospital and only family was allowed. As this description and this photo make clear, this space was both the center of Black community and fundamentally a multiracial neighborhood. Second Baptist was one of the key centers of this community. And here's a photo of the church congregation, we think in 1950. Okay. What's so special about this photo is that Clarence Butler has helped us identify more than 3/4 of the people in it. So for me, the photo and Clarence Butler's memories of the many people in it captures the persistence of the Black community and memory across generations. And we'll share over the course of the rest of my talk some of the stories of the people in this picture and their families as we go. Now, employment opportunities were radically limited for Black people in the first half of the 20th century, even longer, especially before Norton Air Force Base and related industries grew. Black men and women were systematically excluded from most jobs through the 50s and 60s, most limited to domestic labor, the hardest kinds of physical labor. Porters, those kinds of jobs were available. But some Black families in Redlands built businesses in and around this neighborhood. And here's a map of a few we found so far, which is not insubstantial given that we've just begun this research fairly recently. And I'll point out just a few of the stories of these businesses. One right here. Can you see my, oh no, it doesn't actually show. My pointer, do I have to like click a pointer? Maybe, here we go. Is this a pointer? Never mind. Anyway, one in the middle of High Street, kind of up there on the top, is the store of Robert Burton. Robert Burton, right, worked for decades for Harris Company, but he also built a grocery store right in front of his home. It was one of two small Black grocery stores that existed in the neighborhood. The other was run by Mr. Coleman Thomas on High Street, who it turned out had connections to farmers in the Imperial Valley and often brought fresh produce into the store. We have this picture of Mr. Burton's, no, maybe this picture. This picture of Burton's grocery from the Smiley Library. Clarence Thomas, of course, remembers as a kid would, the penny candies, the 2-cent candies you could get from the grocery. But he also has more substantial memories of Mr. Burton. And he meant a lot to him. He said, I always admired him because he was such a businessman. I wanted to be like Mr. Burton, you know. It's kind of how I patterned my life after him. I actually ended up going to work for Beacon's Moving and Storage and became a district manager. And it was all because of him, because I said, if he could do it, I can do it. Mr. Scotland, John H. Scotland, was also a business owner that Clarence Butler remembers, and he operated a tailor from about 1910 on Central Street. So he's the one there on the bottom, one of the little houses there on the bottom. Look, hey, there we go. There we go, okay. All right, so right there, so there's Mr. Burton's store, there's Mr. Thomas's store, and here is where Mr. Scotland ran a tailor shop really from 1910 through the 40s. He's pictured right here, standing next to Mr. Burton when they were both members of the trustee board of Second Baptist. And here he is again in this wonderful photo from 1950. He's this guy in the third row back here, many years later, still a member of the church and still a member of the community. He and his wife bought a large home on Central at 409 Central, right along the kind of creek, where they often hosted lavish dinner parties and fundraisers. He was a graduate of Tuskegee, and Clarence Butler remembers that he sometimes taught at the University of Redlands. I'm trying to trace down more about that. And how beautifully he recited poetry. He especially loved Paul Laurence Dunbar. Other residences built businesses even within the confines of domestic service that so many were kind of pushed into. So as just one example, Hardy Nash was the proprietor of a bootblack stand in front of the barbershop right here on State Street. And his wife, Lulu Nash, was a pretty well-known caterer for wealthy families in Redlands. They lived here until both of them died, him in the mid-40s and her in the mid-50s. And this is my favorite memory that Clarence Butler has shared with me. He remembers that the kids would walk from Franklin down the terrace, because remember, no freeway, down the terrace past her house every day after school. And every day they would call out, "What are you cooking, Miss Nash?" And she would respond coyly, "Nothing, I've got nothing." And they would say, "We can smell it. We know you have something." And then she would soon come out with what he says are, let me find this quote, the trays of the most delicious yeast rolls for us served with butter almost every day. And I love that story so much because it captures, I think, the essence of what the neighborhood was like and how deeply connected folks were to each other. We've also found mention of two other restaurateurs in the neighborhood. Nellie Greenwood ran a restaurant out of her home at 412 Stewart Street. I think it's this one. Oh, it's right there. There we go, right by the church. That building is still there. I was just walking by it today. 412 Stewart Street in 1930. She would later move it just down the block on 7th. The Greenwood family would go on later to develop another prominent Black business in the neighborhood. It was Nellie Greenwood's daughter, Dora Greenwood Mitchell, who would develop the well-known Mitchell quality hand laundry business out of their home in the late 40s. Mrs. Mary Braxton also moved to town in the late 30s while her daughter was earning a music degree at the University of Redlands. And they lived here at the corner of Stewart and High Street, where they also operated the Carolina Kitchen. You can see here their advertisement. You can see here it says restaurant, right? It's a little restaurant. And you can see here that they advertised in the San Bernardino Sun that they had all colored cooks. Yeah, East Stewart, yep. Now, interestingly, yeah, 50 cents. It's the good old days, except not. Interestingly, the same location at the same time served as Redlands Recreation Center #2. This is something I learned like 2 weeks ago. And the press described this as a recreation center devoted to Negroes. Harold Scott was an African-American student at the U of R and the center's supervisor. On opening night, there are articles that talk about the Federal Negro Project Chorus singing there. And later they organized a whist tournament, among other activities. The New Deal recreation program that clearly operated at least for a time in this location opened up some new employment opportunities for young adults in the community. And actually Robert Burton's son, James Burton, and the Collins girls, you'll hear about the Collinses later, all worked for the National Youth Administration as recreation leaders in 1940. And indeed, the New Deal opened up some opportunities for better jobs for African Americans in this region as in the country overall. Besides these businesses, many families saved their money and invested in property in the neighborhood. Joe Butler, a leader at Second Baptist Church, and his wife Hattie moved to Redlands in the early 20s and lived right across the street. Lived right, okay, right here, right there, right, lived right there. Nope, I'm in the wrong place. Lived right here. I can read a map. Okay, lived right there, starting in the early 20s, and they raised their 9 children, including Clarence Butler. Joe Butler first worked as a washman at the Ford dealership in town. There were no Black mechanics at the time, but he ultimately managed to work his way up into that position. He also invested in property. So Clarence Butler remembers going with his dad to collect rent from these little, these little properties up here, right by the electrical station. They had 13 little properties that they rented out to single men. A lot of other families in this neighborhood also invested in small homes that they rented out. The Hangen family, the Coleman Thomas family, the Mitchell family, the AME Church owned these kinds of little properties. One of the Hangen family children, Clabe Hangen, who's now deceased, described the importance of land to Black families who had fled the Jim Crow South when he said, quote, "My father never liked to live on land he couldn't control. So he bought a home with he bought a house with a whole bunch of rentals on it. It was unusual for Black families to earn enough to own land, but families were allowed to own their own homes, mainly around the railroad tracks." And I think we can't emphasize the theme of the importance of home ownership and economic development to Black communities in this era. And so I want to talk a little bit about the ways that Redlands Black community leaders came together in the 30s and 40s to build economic and political power, because these are some of the stories that I find most interesting and inspiring. And I want to highlight the work of Jerome R. Collins, who was really a regional, even a statewide leader in some of these efforts. And he lived right here in town. Mr. Collins and his wife, Pally. Where have I got that? There we go. Mr. Collins and his wife, Callie. I think this is from like a wedding, anniversary celebration, maybe 50-year anniversary celebration, not sure. They first moved from the Imperial Valley from Texas, where they'd been teachers. Family stories said they had to leave Texas because they had helped a Black man hide from a white mob, and because Callie was so light-skinned that some in the white community assumed they were an interracial couple. He bought a ranch in Imperial Valley and began farming, but Callie Collins did not like the rural life. So she took the younger kids and relocated to Redlands. She was an independent woman, as I hear from her grandkids. She worked as a domestic, but with their combined savings, bought this 2-story home on 6th Street. We see here their daughter, Natalie Collin Diggs, out front. For a while, Mr. Collins traveled back and forth, continuing to run his ranch, but eventually the full family settled in Redlands. I think of it as her winning the family argument. He was active in political organizing to increase Black voting power in Redlands and beyond. His daughter Natalie remembered driving him to political meetings in Riverside, and that he actively organized in Valley Truck Farms, where he was a member of the Golden Rule Club of San Bernardino. And if you want to know more about Valley Truck Farms, we have a story map also in the collection about Valley Truck Farms. He was also the founder and president of an interesting organization called the Economic, Political, and Commercial League of California in the early 30s. An article in the California Eagle explained that this organization believes that, quote, "to have political power, we must have economic power. And in order to have economic power, we must have political power. The two must go hand in hand if the race is to make progress." And I love this little clipping I'm showing in particular, because the author, who is Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who was a graduate from the medical school in Loma Linda, as well as a member of this organization, he's clearly picking a fight with more moderate voices at the time and throwing some slight insults at more moderate leaders in Los Angeles. I don't know the full nature of those fights, but it's clearly something that I would love to know more about. By the late 1940s, Jerome Collins had also become a real estate agent, and he had joined forces with his neighbor, Robert Burton. We don't know how they managed to get real estate license, because real estate boards were notoriously racially exclusionary in this time period. But they would begin to build pathways for more Black families to buy homes and land. Now, Black women in Redlands were also actively organizing, in particularly through these political study clubs, which was a network of Black women's clubs that went up and down the state of California. The Redlands branch was called the Phyllis Wheatley Club, and it held monthly sessions on topics like the ballot and the Negro, noted women of our race, and current politics. Here's the president of the Phyllis Wheatley Club in, I think, 1932, 34. She was president for most of the 30s. She's actually Jerome Collins's niece. She lived up on Harold Street with her husband, Thomas Friedman, who was a rail yard carpenter. Here he is, the distinguished looking gentleman on the left in this same photo. All of them were trustees at Second Baptist. All right. She, interestingly, was raised in the Black women's club movement because her mom was a statewide leader in San Diego, even in the 20s. Her mom ran also a music school that was fairly well known called the Freeman Studio of Music in San Diego. For me, the Collins family story is a reminder of how the Great Migration actually created these extended family ties throughout the state and the country. The Collins family had relatives in Imperial Valley, in Stockton, in San Diego. And actually, Mr. Collins would travel to those different cities as part of his political organizing, right? So these extended family ties knit together Black communities in ways that forged the basis for Black political organizing in the decades that would follow. Because I love to map things, we're beginning to map where the other officers in the Phyllis Wheatley Club lived. I noticed they kind of they lived up 6th Street, many of them. And I'll just mention one other family whose story we've begun to document. Here are Deacon Charles and Betty Hughes. Both of them were leaders in Second Baptist all the way back in the early 1900s. She led the state legislation committee for the Phyllis Wheatley Club because they were all about political organizing. And returning to this iconic figure, Mr. Hughes is right here on the far right, left, your left, whatever it is. And when I first looked at this picture, I said to Clarence Butler, who's the white guy sitting on the far corner, right? And Clarence Butler kindly said to me that he wasn't white, he was just very light-skinned. Now, they were both born, he and his wife, in North Carolina in the decades just after emancipation in the 1870s. But they settled to raise their kids in Redlands before 1910. Looking at their family in the census tells us something about shifting racial classifications. They were in fact listed, all of them, as Negro in the 1910 census when they were renting their own home and farming on the outskirts of Redlands. But by 1920 to the 40s, when they owned their home on 6th Street and he's working as a carpenter, the census classified them as white. These were the days when the census goes around and just decides what you are, right? By looking at you and asking some questions. But you know, obviously from what it looks like, white folks could easily assume he was white and maybe in fact did in the course of some of his daily life, but they were active members of the Black community, active in political and social organizations in the city. I want to highlight two events the Phyllis Wheatley Club hosted around 1940, because I think it shows some of the political work that they did. So this is where Mr. and Mrs. Scotland lived, right here by the Mill Creek. They hosted in 1940, in August, a fancy party for 250 people at this home. As it was a fundraiser for the Phyllis Wheatley Club scholarships to support Black college students. The California Eagle described this lavish event hosted on their, quote, unique and spacious patio, which was decorated with garden flowers and gorgeous bouquets of cut flowers in their, quote, colonial and Spanish setting. And wouldn't it be great if this house still lived there, or still was there so we could see what it looked like? But we have to just imagine. Other prominent women in the community like Mrs. Burton, Lulu Nash, Mrs. Betty Hughes helped host similar teas and gatherings, many of which focused on getting Black students into local colleges. And as one example, in October 20th, 1938, Mrs. Scotland hosted a college forum with Black students from the U of R and Valley College, coming to her home along with the University of Redlands president, his wife, and the deans. So why do these stories matter besides being interesting? I think we often think of the civil rights movement as having popped out of nowhere in the mid-50s and as mostly happening in the South. But for me, these Redlands political activists in the 30s and 40s were part of the long civil rights movement. And the networks they formed in those earlier decades fed into the local civil rights struggles in later years. Some of these leaders were in fact active in the first interracial fellowship and civic unity organizations in Redlands in the 40s and 50s. And they brought with them decades of experience of organizing into that work. Jerome Collins and Mrs. Scotland, for example, were part of the interracial fellowship that was organized in Redlands in 1952 to, quote, pool the ideas of people from various races and determine opinions in order to better human relations. David Bullard and his wife Beatrice had lived in Redlands since the 1920s and raised their 9 kids in a home they built on 11th Street. Clarence Butler remembers when he worked as a switchman controlling the train cars for the packing houses right near Second Baptist Church. But Butler also credits his leadership for desegregating Sylvan Pool in the early 1960s. He said, he went downtown to the city and said, we're not going to have this. If our kids want to go down and swim, they should be able to go down any day of the week. And we were allowed to do that mainly because he went down and protested. Some, like Reverend Hopkins, who's the fellow in the center, would join with Amos Isaac Anita Demery, John Coleman, and a range of white Redlands residents to fight for fair housing in the mid and late 60s, when Proposition 14 was on the ballot, and then even after the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. Here we see the group that continued to fight and tried to get Redlands residents to sign a new kind of covenant that was committed to building an inclusive community. You see here, down here, they're asking Redlands residents to sign a commitment that people should be free to choose their housing wherever they want to live. In a way, kind of working against the past history of covenants that had shaped the city so much. It's also out of these rich relationships in this church, also with the leadership of Pastor Hopkins, that the Mootonic Forest singing group was born. We see here Clabe Hangen sitting beside Kenny Pruitt, another member of the singing group, right in the second row. Clarence Butler's in the back, I think. Clabe Hangen would go on to become a professional musician in the folk music scene and play a leading role in civil rights activism. He was in fact the president of the Freedom Schools in San Bernardino during the school boycott for desegregation in the 60s. Others, like his brother Caesar Hangen, died tragically from a football concussion in the first year of college in the 1950s. But he would inspire the next generation of Black community leaders to start a college scholarship in his honor, with groups like the Neighbors Club and the Adrianettes carrying forward the work of earlier generations of club women. When Clarence Butler grew up and joined the Mootonic Four, he was embedded in this tightly knit community, and the close relationships formed in this neighborhood remain today. It's in fact why I have any of these stories to share with you today, or any of these pictures, because Clarence Butler is still in touch with so many people who can share them. But if you go to the neighborhood around Second Baptist today, it's hard to see the small, vibrant community that was there. Most of these houses where folks lived here in 1940 are gone. And you can see what the area looks like today. In the 1950s, the freeway cut this neighborhood off from itself. And downtown redevelopment plans zoned much of it for commercial use. In fact, Clarence Butler's own home would be right about that. Clarence Butler remembers back in 1955 when the community first got wind of some of those plans. Old Man Dill was coming around trying to buy everybody's property, he said. And Clarence Butler remembers his parents and others going around and wondering, what's going on? Why is Old Man Dill trying to buy everybody's property? So some of the parents went down to the planning department. They said that they're going to build a shopping mall there. And then he said they understood why. Quote, he wanted to own everyone's property. So when the contractors could come, he would get all the money. So nobody sold to him once they found out what was going on. The freeway and redevelopment plans, though, meant that people had to look for new places to build community and buy homes. Some people from the neighborhood, like Fanny Sargent, bought their first home in San Bernardino, in a growing Black community there. Others moved into the projects on Texas Street, where they remember a vibrant community in the 50s and early 60s, but not one that enabled families to build wealth through home ownership. But once again, Robert Burton enters our story. He helped many Black Redlands residents buy homes and rebuild their community in Lagonia Terrace, or what many call Texonia Village. You can see here advertisements from 1955 with a photo of Robert Burton right here. And it says right here, may be hard to read the print, but it says importantly, not for some, but for all people. And this was a clear, if subtle, reference to the racial exclusions in housing that were common in many other neighborhoods in Redlands, right? He was saying, this is a neighborhood where anyone can come move and we will live and we will welcome you. Robert Burton sold Clarence Butler's two older siblings homes in this development in the mid-50s. Then he sold Joe and Hattie Butler their home on Francis Street. He even sold Clarence Butler his first home on Carlotta Court. John Coleman remembers how Robert Burton swung by his home one day when he was renting on Carlotta Court and said, you kids need to come look at some other options. And he drove him and his wife to see several open homes in this neighborhood. They finally bought one. John Coleman said, I think of Bob Burton as the hero of this area. Basically, he was, from my point of view, a major figure in terms of providing housing resources for folks. Ultimately, the center of the Black community would shift by the late 50s from Stewart and High to the area around Texonia Park in West Redlands. And Robert Burton helped at least some hold on to the dream of homeownership in the process. Now, the community that folks built in that new neighborhood is another story, which I do hope to tell later. But the uphill battle of Black families to build homes and build economic security and wealth would remain. The home values in those multiracial neighborhoods did not grow at the same rate as in all white neighborhoods, largely because white home buyers then and today tend to avoid buying homes in more diverse neighborhoods. And this difference in home values accounts for much of the wealth disparity you see between Black folks and white folks today. The history of housing segregation shaped patterns of Black settlement in Redlands and fundamentally shaped the city itself. The North Side, north of the train tracks and later the freeway, was and remained a multiracial community. But South Redlands was a segregated white community well through the 60s, and it remains disproportionately white today. When we look at the small numbers of Black residents in Redlands through the 20s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, even as Black migration to the IE skyrockets, I think we have to remember that this pattern is not only accidental. As this map shows, I think that there were actually more Black residents in Redlands in 1910 than there were in San Bernardino, or at least very close. I haven't counted exactly, but very close, and I think more. But from the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, the Black community of San Bernardino skyrocketed and the Black community of Redlands did not. Page. Housing discrimination and the limited job opportunities in Redlands pushed many Black families to leave and build their homes in other cities. For me, in some ways, okay, we can see this. I was going to show you this map. So this is what the Black population of the IE looks like in 1960. We see substantial growth in North Fontana, on the west side and south side of San Bernardino, in the Meade Valley, and on the east side of Riverside. But Redlands Black community remains, even in 1960, roughly 2% concentrated just in this area here. And that's, I think, understating the segregation because it's in fact concentrated in a much smaller area to the west. So housing discrimination kind of limited opportunities for folks to move in Redlands. And for me, in some ways, I think this map is like the effect of the message that Robert Burton received when he got off the train in Redlands in 1922. There is no place for you to stay here, son, but multiplied over decades on a larger scale. For me, the work of documenting Black history in Redlands is one small way we can create a different future. The one that Robert Burton envisioned when he tried to build communities that were for all of us, not just some of us. And I'll end there and open it up for questions or comments or anything. Oh, except I will stop sharing and I will play you guys, especially those of you online who didn't get the chance to hear it. I will play you one song. What do you think of what questions you have? And I will play the song Joy because it's my favorite.
I can tell the nation what my Jesus and my Lord has done. My Lord, to comfort us, joy, great joy to my soul.
All right, we'll stop there so that we do have time for questions. But I can play more later for you. Questions? Yes, sir.
You know, if we had to draw a map like that today, how would it appear?
Right, I do have maps like that today. Well, they appear similar, but less segregated. You see the segregation increase until 1970 and then slightly decrease, but only slightly. But South Redlands and North Redlands, you continue to see some of those same disparities in terms of race. Not absolute segregation, right? Segregation looks different now. Folks, if you have enough money, you can live where you want. But this history continues to kind of reverberate in the present because it kind of shapes who has that wealth to buy homes, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I read where, was he associated in any way, where I read Second Baptist Church, so it seemed like it's.
No, I don't think so. At least not that I know of. No, the answer is no. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was that the gentleman in the back thought that he had heard that Arthur Gregory was connected to Second Baptist Church in some way, and he couldn't quite rectify that with the fairly racist housing ad, but it's maybe a different Gregory or anyway. First Baptist Church. That would be the difference. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you have the names of the quartet that was in Clarence and guys?
It's called the Mutonic Four. Actually, Clarence can maybe better answer that question because it's like there are 3 generations of that quartet, right?
Played in that?
Clay was in the original quartet, well, it was a quintet that
Mm.
Reverend Charles Hopkins
Yeah.
formed when he first came to Redlands.
Mhm.
And then as they got older and went off to college, then they dropped down to an art era.
Yeah.
He was doing solo work then after.
Yes.
After he graduated.
Yeah.
Clay,
Mhm.
Clay was doing solo work, correct?
Yeah. So yeah, Clay Pangan, in fact, we unfortunately didn't get to interview him for the archive because he passed, but we've been interviewing his kids and his wife, and trying to document some of his story because he's a big person in both music and kind of civil rights organizing in the area. Yeah.
Tell them where the McKinley residential covenants were located.
What do you mean we're located?
Well,
You tell them. I think
Cope Junior High.
right across from
Right across from Cope Junior High.
right across from Cope
All
Junior
the
High.
streets
Right.
that had Republican names, Polk and through there.
Okay.
That was the restricted neighborhood that was on the south side, built in the 1920s.
Yeah. The thing we're not quite sure which, we know where we found the restrictions. There are a bunch of other neighborhoods where we find weird language like, any restrictions that are already there are still in place, but we can't find any original restrictions. And so we don't know whether they were restricted neighborhoods or not. I mean, we know in practice that they were because real estate agents wouldn't sell there, but we don't know whether they were codified in that form or not. Yeah.
The Lala streets, La Cresta, and all those that are south of Crescent Avenue, that area there, built in the 1920s, was also
Right.
restricted neighborhoods, except when you get to 1965 and the Civil Rights Act making those restrictions quite illegal, they remain on the original deeds and covenants that the county recorder's office had.
Yeah.
And one of my students in 1973 was down at the county recorder's office and mentioned that those were illegal, unconstitutional. And the county recorder's office says, oh my God, we'll have to go through and delete all of those throughout the county. I said, get started because it's a big county.
Well, for historical purposes, I wish they hadn't deleted them, but just put them aside into the archive. Yeah.
Our son and daughter-in-law, and they bought a house on 622 South Buena Vista. Our daughter-in-law is Hispanic, but her family's been here longer than most of the whites. And the covenants, when they were looking at the old deeds, was that, yes, you could have servants that were whatever, Hispanic or Black, but, and she is Hispanic, but I mean, how many years further back than the rest of us? And they kind of, they talked to us about and said, house built probably in maybe the 40s after the Depression, but it's 22 South Buena Vista cottage style. But
Where was Lagonia Terrace?
Where's what? Lagonia Terrace?
Yeah.
So that neighborhood is Francis, Karen, and Sharon. Right?
Texas and Lagonia.
Yeah, Texas and Lagonia.
That was Texonian Village.
Yes, right. That is right. Called that. Yes, as well.
But wasn't that, oh, okay.
Well, so
The homes are Texas Village.
yeah,
And you have the park.
But it was called both things.
it was called both things as far as I can tell. Yeah. Yep. It was called both things as far as I can tell in different eras of different advertising. Yeah.
On the advertisement, it said there were several different buildings.
Layouts. Yeah.
But they were all the same.
Yeah, well, it may have been that there are two developments that are called similar things, like right after each other. So it might be that like one is like right beside the other and then gets built a little bit later. Yeah, but that's good question. Yeah.
Southern Redlands, was it demarcation?
Well, in the old days,
The Zoom people can't hear unless we
Sorry.
talk into the computer.
Oh, into the computer.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you repeat your
Sorry.
question so we can repeat it to the Zoom
I can repeat it.
Okay.
So he asked basically, what's the demarcation line between South Redlands and North Redlands? I would say in the old days, it was the railroad tracks, right? And then when the freeway was built, it became the freeway in a way.
We've clarifying question.
Okay.
How do the people you've talked to recall the construction of the highway and its impact on the Black Redlands community? Was it a shock, tragic, traumatizing, or just part of the struggle at the time?
Okay. So how do people I've talked to remember the construction of the freeway? Was it just expected, dramatic, or what at the time? I don't know. Can I just turn the question to you? I'm going to turn that question over to Clarence Butler. But I think in different ways, I think in some ways, that particular community was being displaced by two things at once, right? So, it was being displaced both by the freeway and by the city's plans to make it a commercial neighborhood. But come here and answer the question, Clarence Butler, because I'm not going to speak for you.
Most of the freeway, which is called Highway Interstate 10, went through the orange groves mostly, and not actually through the city, except when it came down through Pearl.
Yeah.
That's when they ended up getting some of the residential areas where most of the Blacks and the Spanish lived. But most of the freeway actually went through orange groves where you could go look at on both sides and it was just orange trees and almost into San Bernardino. And so it didn't affect us too much as far as housing is concerned.
Yeah. And I think also in some ways the community was at that point, the exact point moving, right? For all of those reasons together to a different space. I think it's a little bit different in San Bernardino. So when you talk to folks in San Bernardino about the 215 freeway and when that was built, they call it, some people like Hardy Brown Sr. calls it the Berlin Wall, right? Because when it was built, the freeway exits and entrances were designed to go only away from the historic Black and Mexican neighborhood. And so it cut off, and people remember it like instantly destroying businesses there. That sort of, not because it built over them, but because it took the traffic off of Route 66 away from them and filtered it all into downtown. And so that I think people have really stronger memories of it as disruptive, whereas in Redlands, the community was being dispersed in all kinds of ways. So the freeway was only one thing. Yeah.
I'm sure there were lots of old.
I graduated high school with Clarence in 1960. I'd love to say I never thought of Clarence as anything but a friend, but he had to have felt terribly isolated. There were 3 Black kids in our high school class
In 1960.
in 1960.
And that included you, Piper, which would have been pretty lily white.
Yeah.
I would just like to say Clarence has always been a friend.
Oh, and you're talking about the freeway. I grew up, I went to Lagonia School and grew up on 825 Orange Street. And my dad went out and fought against the freeway going through the middle of town, thought it should have been out in San Mateo Canyon because and not for the reason, but just that it was going to split the town, which it did. We were already north side, south side. So yeah, I mean, I'm a north sider, Clarence.
Right. I mean, I do think, that question, I think a lot of people, and I hear this more in the stories that Antonio collected of Mexican American elders in Redlands, the degree to which folks really felt like that freeway disrupted and destroyed the connection of community and the connection to downtown.
I was going to ask, I'm sure there were shocking facts found, or maybe they're not shocking to you anymore, in your research for this project. Can you express some of the more positive shocking experiences that you found out about?
Well, all of them, right? I mean, the discovering these Black women's clubs and organizing college scholarships in the middle of the Depression, right? I mean, that I find amazing. It's both amazing and inspiring, and it's kind of depressing because we're still having the conversations about how to create more pathways for Black students to college. So there's an inspirational part and a kind of we can build on the legacies of past leaders. So I think I find that really inspiring. I mean, my favorite story, as I said before, I love the little stories of just people in the neighborhood and how connected they were. So when Clarence Butler and I went to go interview Fanny Sargent, who is 94, just in December. And she was telling us that story of the Italian guy in the neighborhood who cooked all the great food and, you know, and lied to the doctor so we could go visit his neighbor. I mean, I find that like, that's beautiful, right? It shows us that interracial neighborhoods and relationships were possible then, right? And ways that didn't always happen, right? but did, and that we should recognize where they happened, and celebrate, in some ways, celebrate the spaces of the North Side where they really did have, that were sort of multiracial spaces, all the way back, more than we do.
Very good. Well, thanks so much, Jennifer. We really appreciate it. This has been a wonderful example of taking a detailed look at our neighborhoods in Redlands and the rich history that we can get when we do the type of research that they're doing, especially oral history. So we'll see you all next month with Tom slideshow presentation. Thank you.
Oh, and if you're interested in more information about the oral history project that this is connected to, there are some, we've made some little cards in the back that you can take, which have a couple of the photos. I love them. And they provide a kind of QR code, which we now all know how to do because of COVID. A QR code that take you to the website of the archive and to like a little video of the archive. Like that. Clarence Butler and John Coleman's interviews are there.
Jen, I have a quick question. Some people were taking pictures of some of your presentation of the news articles. Is there a way to make that presentation available to the people who showed up today?
Well, I'm going to make that presentation a story map that's going to have all the citations and stuff, which, like as a scholar, I feel a little bit better at. Yes. So I think that within a month that will actually be published online. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll share follow-up information about your website and some of the links with the folks who showed up and the RSVPs on Zoom. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.